Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And today I want to just briefly go back on the issue of Niger, or Niger, as some will pronounce it. Now, for some of you who might know, Niger is a West African country which borders Nigeria and Mali and other countries, among others. Now, as a brief background, there was a coup, I think around a month ago, where a democratically elected president, after um, a new constitution was observed and uh, brought into action, was removed in a coup d'etat by a military officer who is said to be um, uh, trained and in terms of his military career in the United States, among others. Since then, ECOWAS, which is the economic uh, organization in West Africa that encompasses a number of countries, issued an ultimatum for the coup to be reversed, or else military action would follow. They set a deadline, which came and went, and the military coup leaders in Niger stood their ground and they have vowed to defend their country. Furthermore, other countries have, I think a couple of countries have said they will be on the side of Niger if military action were to happen. There's also seem to be mixed views around the world, especially from the African continent, in terms of the intervention by ECOWAS, but also whilst facing the dilemma that coup d'etats are not the best way of um, improving and governing countries, because that just sets up a spiral of counter coups and violence. The African Union also met and had a discussion around the subject, but it's not very clear what their position is at the moment. But what is also noticeable or notable is that they didn't necessarily come out fully to endorse military intervention. So that's sort of the background. And the coup happened on the 26th of July, where soldiers loyal to General Abdul Hamani Tiani detained Nigeria's president, Mohamed Bazoum, and they declared a full military takeover by the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. And there followed condemnation across the world for weeks, which brings us to where we are now. What we want to discuss now is in terms of the impact on the wider challenge on democracy in the region, which extends beyond Niger. There appears to be no compromise in sight. The CNSP, which is the coup d'etat leaders, have tried to force Bazoum into resigning in the hope of rebranding themselves as pragmatic managers of a political transition, according to an observer's view from one of the think tanks in London, Chatham House. And he has, however, stood firm. And ECOWAS has also responded in kind, immediately imposing heavy economic sanctions and threatening a military intervention, as I mentioned before. So there's no compromise in sight. So what are some of the reasons that motives that um, you know, could have led to the coup? Obviously, no one is in the head of the coup leaders, but one can only project views and speculate based on publicly available facts. And they appear to have been, from their own statements, motivated by security and governance concerns, as well as what is termed as post hoc justifications that um, have also met with adverse reactions from across the world. Um, it is important to note, as I noted in another episode before, that as democracy in Niger was not perfect, but there had been some sort of constitutional forward step that up until last July was appears to be taking shape, and that track record of matters because it highlights the essential parochial and personal motivation of the junta in terms of the officers' opposition at the dismissal of Armed Forces Chief of Staff General Salif Mode in April, and rumors that he was on the verge of sacking yet another general. So, could that be one of the motivations? Um, Again, as I mentioned, there has been some sort of support from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, and from other actors, private actors. Um, so that is, one can only speculate of what the motivations are and what are the stakes for ECOWAS. Now for ECOWAS, the future of democracy, according to Chatham House, across West Africa is at stake. And in its high point in 2017, there was, as I mentioned, the civilian-led government, which civilian-led governments, at least across the 15 West African countries. However, in the last few months, 3 years, there has been around 6 military coups, two in Mali and Burkina Faso, and it appears that the progress that was made has now been rolled back. And I think there's also widespread concern that the nature of the Niger's coup increased some of those concerns. Because in Mali and Guinea, as well as Burkina Faso, there were structural drivers that apparently explain political change. However, for example, Mali's president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, had neglected, according to observers, neglected northern and central regions. Elections had been manipulated and urban protests were repressed with lethal violence. Whilst Guinea's president, Alpha Conde, is said to have rigged a constitutional referendum on a third term, and Burkina Faso's Roch Marc Christian Kabore seemed at loss in the face of the jihadist attacks that repeatedly claimed heavy army casualties. So, in juxtaposition of the above, so the motives behind the coup in Niger look somehow from a narrow perspective and what some consider myopic and essentially just a power grab that could put stability and the sort of slow process in terms of development and security at stake for what observers think is personal gain for a few elite military leaders. I mean, that's just one view. And also, obviously, by being internally distracted, that may also impact the focus on the external threats from other groups that have been spreading and involved in attacks across the region. And there also seems to be an emerging ideological challenge, which is the accelerating trend of military coups across West Africa, and which has evolved into sort of more fundamental ideological challenge to the long long-standing ECOWAS model of civilian-led constitutional and pluralist government, buttressed by close development and military partnerships with the West and the UN system. And so this seems to be the new wave of coups seems to indicate a new brand of military regimes that are taking root in a context of in a context where generally young and urbane people, young persons from West Africa are increasingly disillusioned with the traditional political class, and there's widespread resentment of one of the major colonial powers in the region, France, and also seemed taken to be one of the most visible partner, quote unquote, in many countries. So when Niger fell, despite the progress on in the context of the metrics of democracy and security in the region, um, the that sort of leads to some questions around the roots of West Africa's cause, the causes, is it misgovernance or palace politics, but also highlights the complex interplay of emerging identities where new social attitudes and popular rejection of business as usual politics. And there are also other external parties that may be involved, but that's a matter for others to speculate. Um, so ECOWAS, in its way, has failed to secure popular support or the backing of other African Union member states in relation to its threat to use force against the Nigerian junta, while sanctions may be a blunt instrument that allow pushists, um, i.e., coup, deter um, enforcers to present themselves as defenders of the people subjected to hardship by bullying regional neighbors. So that essentially leaves um, the only slow, unglamorous, greasy, mechanic one option, which is politics and democracy. And that in itself um, is where essentially it should have started. And so the challenges to democracy, not just in the region, in West Africa, but across the continent, posed by the Niger coup, is immense, where there's an interplay of a young population that wants not only democratic governance, but basic infrastructure, such as functioning road systems, electricity, internet, because they see um, the the benefits of an exposure of social media on the internet, and they see how other people live, and they're not prepared, would appear, to just be essentially passive in their lives. And so that maybe explain why there are successive coups in the region, or whether it's opportunism, or whether they're